China and the United States are on a collision course, where each nation's vital interests need to be acknowledged if we want to avoid a catastrophic war. I think it's already safe to say that a new Cold War has begun between the two countries and their spheres of influence. In this video, I'm going to explain roughly why these two nations are destined for war from a realist philosophical perspective about human nature and human relations. I'm also going to explain why this war isn't inevitable, but why there is still going to be a contest. So, before we talk about China and the United States, I want to roughly sketch out human relations to explain why war happens in the first place. Humans have the capacity to either have conflictual or cooperative relationships with each other, be it individuals, groups and tribes of people, or modern nation states. The degree of conflict or cooperation might vary, but all relations still fall on that spectrum. So for example, you might have families and relationships, and those are the most cooperative relationships that human beings can have, where you also can have arch nemesis or bullies, and those are the most conflictual. The more that the values between individuals or groups of people are misaligned, the more conflictual it can be. You might argue that there's also the possibility for avoidance, but when we consider our globalized world, for states, it's nearly impossible. For these reasons, I believe the study of international relations is primarily understood through the theoretical lens of liberalism and realism. Liberalism accounts for how and why cooperation happens, usually on the basis of shared economic ties, international organizations to facilitate agreements, diplomacy, usually underpinned by similar goals and values of each nation-state. Realism, on the other hand, accounts for conflict, usually on the basis of existential needs like territorial safety and security, domestic sovereignty, and protection of the populace's values. When conflict by other means, like verbal disputes, fails to secure your needs, it can become violent. Both Karl von Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, two of the most famous philosophers on war, view war as an extension of politics. If there is a fundamental threat to a person's political unit, the ends of survival justify the means of violence. History and evolution is evidence of this principle. Between states in an anarchical system, with no higher adjudicating authority, it's essentially survival of the fittest, despite international organizations like the UN's best attempts to mitigate conflict. State power rules the international system. So now that we've analyzed why war happens in the international system, let's get back to China and the United States currently. To understand this dynamic, I'm going to be referring to Graham Allison's work. Graham Allison is a leading scholar of international relations at Harvard School of Government. In 2017, he published a book called Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? His thesis is based on Thucydides' work. Thucydides is considered the father of both scientific history and political realism. He noticed that the Peloponnesian War was caused by the conditions of a rising Sparta, which challenged a dominant Athens for regional supremacy in and around Greece. Allison expands on this idea and says that due to fundamental points of conflict, be them differing values or competition over limited resources, the dynamics of a rising power which challenges an existing power usually results in war. So, what are some of the main conflict points between the United States and China? First, there are conflicting claims over the South China Sea. China essentially claims total control of the sea. The UN's limits of control over oceans say that states can only claim control of the ocean 200 nautical miles from the coast. China's claims extend over 1,000 nautical miles. But 30% of all trade goes through that sea. So China's claims threaten the economic security of the United States and their allies. Another huge point of contention is Taiwan. China claims that Taiwan is a rogue province of the People's Republic of China, PRC. In the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan is a remnant from the Chinese Civil War, which ended in 1949. When the CCP took control over mainland China and forced the opposing Kuomintang to flee to the island of Taiwan. The PRC has maintained claims over Taiwan ever since, and in recent years the threat of a forced annexation are looking even more threatening. Meanwhile, the U.S. has made informal agreements to defend the democratic nation and formally supplies the island nation with defense capabilities, a policy of deliberate ambiguity. On top of that, Taiwan produces the majority of the world's microchips. So needless to say, that would really impact the West if China took control over Taiwan. Finally, there are concerns of sovereignty for America and its allies by way of international leverage. China is growing its international leverage, both through existing institutions, but also by creating its own international organizations like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to compete with the World Bank, and international developments like the Belt and Road Initiative, which will connect large regions of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East to economic centers in China. With China having more influence internationally, that could threaten Western values. So for example, the US-led liberal international order has served to spread the values of capitalism and to some extent democracy throughout the world, through the leverage of international organizations. Most of all, though, it's been used to secure American interests internationally. We can look at Chinese actions domestically and see how they might behave in the international system. Domestically, China disregards human rights, overlooks environmental concerns, and suppresses freedom of speech. Their influence can already be seen, with WHO representatives not recognizing Taiwan due to pressure from the CCP, or businesses like Google and Disney adapting their practices to be allowed in the Chinese market. Concerns of values are, very broadly speaking, over the US securing individual liberties versus the Chinese securing a harmonious community, both serving their national interests. So are China and the United States destined for war? Well, probably a long and contentious Cold War at least. As far as avoiding a direct hot war, Graham Allison offers some further insights, especially based on the Cold War. He says that an accurate assessment of each nation's vital interests, security, and sovereignty needs can mitigate a conflict. Each side has to be crystal clear on what those are. For example, during the Cold War, JFK was crystal clear that nuclear weapons in Cuba were an existential threat for America, and conversely, Khrushchev made it clear that missiles in Turkey were a threat for the USSR. We should not demonize China, but we should seek to understand them. Cooperate where we can, but be firm and steadfast on issues that are vital to us. If we do not engage with this situation with eyes wide open and instead avoid the issues, sweeping them under the rug, it could cause a miscalculation and escalate the situation horrifically. It's time for the West to engage China carefully but assertively. Each state must recognize the other's needs and articulate their own clearly so that they can cooperate effectively and hopefully escape Thucydides' trap.